Hello everyone, welcome to Sage's Tabletop Table Talks. I'm Sage. This is my tabletop. I'm going to talk to you about tabletop role-playing games. As somebody with a tiny bit of martial arts experience, both weapon and unarmed, I would like to talk to you about martial arts and specifically throwing punches in tabletop role-playing games. I was originally going to take some various systems and rank them. And as I was trying to kind of go through that, I came to the realization that ranking martial arts in tabletop role-playing games is kind of a futile effort because there's so much of it that's system heavy. For example, rating how martial arts work in Exalted against how they work in Rifts are two completely separate monsters. Although Rifts Palladium's is way worse than Exalted's. So I just kind of want to talk about throwing punches, throwing hands in ttrpgs. A lot of older games I've noticed, Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition and Palladium kind of have this weird, absolute lack of any kind of balance when it comes to throwing punches in games. And a lot of games from the 80s do. It's like, okay, well, Palladium is a great example of this. So it's like in Palladium, you can throw a punch. It does 1d4 damage. You can throw a kick. It does 1d6 damage. Or you can throw a roundhouse kick. It does 2d4 damage. Why would you ever throw anything but a roundhouse kick? Why is anybody doing anything but roundhouse kicks in this universe? There's no accuracy difference. It's not like punching somebody's more accurate, more reliable than throwing a roundhouse kick. You just straight up do more damage. And as you get better, you get the ability to do things like dragging kicks and sweeping kicks, things like that. And the first chance you get to learn an unarmed strike, just pick the one that does the most damage, because that's the only one you're really ever going to need. Why would you ever throw a 1d4 punch when you can throw a 3d6 whirling dragging kick? It doesn't cost anything to do. It's not less accurate. You just do more than triple damage with that attack than you would with the standard punch. And Palladium's not the only game I've seen do it, but Palladium's one that's most prominent. And then in Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, if you're grabbing a dude, grappling, you roll on this d20 chart that both determines your 2-hit and what attack you do. Meaning on the chart, it's like a 1, but because a 1 is always a miss, it doesn't matter throwing a jab. And I'm pretty sure there's like a similar thing with throwing unarmed attacks. Like, you roll a d20, you get a 5. Well, you throw a jab. It doesn't fucking matter. Like, you don't have any control. There's no strategy. It's just two guys kind of wildly flailing at each other. And that's not realistic, but it's also not fun. I'm not going to get too much into realism here, mostly because, and it's something I absolutely cannot stand with, like weapons tube and things like that, guys. And the ones that come to mind are Sellsword Arts, and I know that they are fond. I know a lot of it is just kind of high jelly, kind of tongue in cheek, but it creates this very weird discourse around martial combat in games where like there's this idea of realism. They talk about how swords aren't strength weapons, and they absolutely are strength weapons. They're just also dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, and charisma weapons. You kind of need all of those to be a good martial artist. And this is kind of a tangent, but I kind of feel the need to put it anyway. They showed this thing where they had a guy who was like a strong man, and he, held the sword, and they showed that with proper structure, they could, he couldn't mess their attack. He couldn't break their guard, but with bad structure, they could break his guard. But here's the thing. Having good structure is part of the strength stat, you dimwits. This idea that strength is exclusively the ability to lift, this is the whole problem with discussions among tabletop role-playing games, is you've latched onto a single concept of this idea with no ability to extrapolate. Like, I can attack 6 times, and okay, you can attack 6 times. Are those 6 attacks going to do anything? Are those 6 attacks going to actually have a chance of going through? And even if you are that good of a swordsman, are those 6 attacks going to have the chance of going through a world where characters have magical floating shields, force fields, psychic abilities, where there's flames wrapped around your body, where there's lightning bolts buzzing past your head? You're not, I mean, okay, you might be in a duel, but realistically, if you're an adventurer, you're not in a duel. You're in a combat scenario where you're fighting a dude. Those 4 attacks might be on a target, but you've also got fireball that just whipped by your head, an explosion just burst on your left. There's a guy back behind him shining a flashlight in your eyes to heal his buddy. There's a dog biting at your ankles. Your friend's dog is behind you barking and yapping. Are you effectively in this scenario going to throw 6 attacks, 7 attacks, 8 attacks in 6 seconds and move? You're not. You guys are looking at this as though you're in a studio doing dueling, and that's not the case. And likewise, it's also just not fun if you had a fighter that could throw 22 attacks in a turn, and a wizard who, if somebody breathed on him, would lose a spell. Very kind of similar to older editions of Dungeons and Dragons, where wizards could lose their spells at any time. That's not as fun. If I'm playing a kick-ass wizard, I want to be a kick-ass wizard. And yeah, if you want to play a kick-ass fighter, you should be able to play a kick-ass fighter. But both characters have to be able to be around each other. And I know wizards now are so much more powerful than marshals. I don't think marshals need a buff. I think spellcasters need a nerf. Anyway, not the point. The point is that Dungeons & Dragons and most tabletop role-playing games are fantastical games. Palladium is fantasy. Shadowrun is science fantasy. If you're playing in the Star Wars universe, it's science fantasy. If you're playing Star Trek, you're probably not getting in unarmed fights that often anyway. I mean, yeah, Captain Kirk got into more than he should have. But realistically, if you're playing in a universe like that, you're just not using that many. You're not throwing that many punches. If you're playing a game like Recon, you're not throwing that many punches. You're using, assault rifles. If you're playing a game that's historical, you're not going to have wizards. I'm sorry. But most of these games are meant to be fantastical, epic, big. And that's where my ability to be a martial artist comes in. Exalted does it the best. Weapon of the Gods isn't too bad about it. Trying to think of some of the other ones. Feng Shui is pretty good about being able to throw a punch at somebody and actually meaning something. But those are games that are almost exclusively about martial arts. I want to play a martial artist in a fantasy world. And once again, you can make the argument, well, it's just not realistic to have a monk in a fantasy world. Yes, I'm glad that you're a fucking half-dragon knight, you're a cat girl wizard, your elf fucking, warlock. I'm glad that who are going off to, kill a dragon to steal his magic sword. I'm glad that realism is what's important to you in your game. You fucking idiot. Like, if you're telling me that you need realism in a game with wizards and dragon people, I'm sorry, I don't mean to gatekeep, but you're a fucking idiot and you don't belong at this discussion at this table. Just straight up. Go sit back at the kiddie table where you belong and let the adults have a conversation. But like as somebody who's very, very into martial arts, very, very into, I like weapons, but I also like unarmed combat. I've studied Kung Fu, Tai Chi, Karate, Krav Maga, Jiu-Jitsu, Judo, Aikijitsu. I've studied, Siva. I've studied Muay Thai. I've studied Taekwondo. I enjoy martial arts. And as such, I think it's fun to play fantasy martial arts. I like playing the kind of monk character. I like playing a character that can, punch a dude in the next week. And in Exalted, you literally can punch a dude in the next week. I think they're the Sidriels, the people they have like abilities where they can like hit it, they can like karate chop a dude and like he disappears from next Tuesday. Just like he just leaves until next Tuesday. And that shit's fucking cool. And we need more of that in our, I have, a combination of chronic bronchitis, so just constant cough, and we heat our house with fuel oil. So I am the driest human being on the face of the earth. I am like fucking mummified. I'm basically beef jerky right now. Yeah, beef jerky. But anyway, shit, I forgot. But like, I like the idea of being able to play a guy who can hold his own. Realistically, I understand that even at my level of martial arts, if I gave somebody who's never held a weapon before a short sword, I am still, even with the disparity of our skills, I am still probably going to end up dead in that fight because the level you have to have as an unarmed fighter to stand with anyone with a weapon is astronomical. It's actually, and I kind of go off from the martial arts. One of the things I love when people who study martial arts try to talk about, disarming people with knives or guns or clubs. Like, I'm not saying you shouldn't practice that because it is good to have that practice in. And honestly, I like to. There's kids in the neighborhood, and I like to give them LARPing swords, Nerf swords, and I like to try to do like disarms and stuff with them because you should. I'm a firm believer that as a martial artist, you should train yourself in a situation where you're at such a disadvantage, it forces you to kind of push beyond your limits. But I am under no illusion that in a realistic fight, if I gave somebody with even the slightest bit of training a longsword and I had to fight them unarmed, I would end up with my limbs lost. Like, I would be dead. There is no question in my mind about it. However, wizards, dragons, fucking, elves, fucking, literal, like, embodiments of deities and half angels, half demons. We're not talking realism. So I want a dude who can punch a dude into next week. When you don't look about Dungeons and Dragons, if you're looking at unarmed strikes, like, if you're not a monk, you're honestly just better off running. There's nothing you can do with a punch in Dungeons and Dragons that even fucking matters. D20 Modern is even worse with it. I'll actually talk about that because D20 Modern has literally one of the worst unarmed strike systems I've ever seen. I'll get into it. But even if you're a monk, you start 1d4 damage with your unarmed strikes, and you get that for like the first 4 to 5 levels. For the first couple levels, if your damage output is the same as a dude with a knife, that is so unsatisfying for what is supposed to be a martial class. It can get better. It gets better as it goes on, but you're like level 10, level 11, something like that. Before your unarmed strike actually has any comparable damage to a fighter's weapon, monks do get flurry of blows, which is nice. Basically, they get 1 extra attack because they're throwing hands, feet, knees, elbows, headbutts, shoulder butts. So the idea is you're just kind of flurrying every limb you got instead of being dedicated with a single weapon. But it just doesn't make up for it. Why can't my monk's unarmed strike just do short sword damage from jump or long sword damage from jump. Um, I think the Battlemaster monk or Iron Palm monk or whatever the fuck it's called, the monk that specializes in unarmed strikes, they should get a boost to it because like if you're being the monk that just hits a dude hard, that's your thing. You should do more than the monk who's throwing fireballs or the monk who's like punching wounds out of people, which is fucking awesome. Some of the shit the monk subclasses do are amazing and I love them. And I wish the rest of the monk was better. Um, and the problem is in D&D, the monk just doesn't know what it wants to do. And even if you want to build a guy like there's no fighter that just hits a dude hard. Unarmed strike damage is so bad. D20 Modern has one of the worst. So here's how D20 Modern works. Your unarmed attack does 1d3, I think, plus your strength modifier damage. So it does, at maximum, 3 damage plus your strength modifier. So we'll say 6. If your damage does not overcome their constitution, you do nothing. If it does, you stun them or some shit. But what that means is 2 average fighters literally cannot hurt each other with an unarmed strike. No one has ever in D20 Modern been punched in the jaw in a fucking bar fight and been knocked unconscious, been knocked out, had their fucking jaw had to be rewired, had to have their, nose fixed. Because it doesn't matter how many times I punch you in the face, nothing is ever going to come from it. D20 Modern is meant to skew more realistic, and I get the logic that in most fights between untrained people, often it escalates to weapons, which is true. It is true that more often than not, if 2 people are unarmed fighting, one person will often pull a knife or grab a rock, use an improvised weapon, something of that nature. But the reason that person usually does it is because they're losing and about to fucking get their head kicked into the pavement. There's abilities you can take that do extra damage, and one of the ones that's okay is Knockout Blow, which increases your damage to a 1d8 if you catch them off guard. So it is, and it's just going sucker punch, bitch, bam! And if that doesn't work, then you're kind of SOL because then you're back to 2 dudes just kind of, slap fighting each other until the DM gets so bored that nothing happens. In older editions of D&D, like 3rd edition, your unarmed strike by default did subdual damage. I get what that's going for. So for those of you who aren't old, subdual damage was this kind of damage you took in older edition and mainly 3rd edition of Dungeons & Dragons. That was non-lethal damage that was meant to represent things like bruises and fatigue, because the argument that hit points is meat needs more fucking... And nope, on task. But, which meant that, I get that, but it also meant that throwing punches, once again, meant, at the end of the day, virtually nothing. And I'm sorry if a fucking U.S. Marine, an equivalent of a fighter, came and punched me in the face. It would not be a surface level wound. It would not be something that would just be blown off. If you play the White Wolf games, they have a similar thing to subdual damage. They have like bashing damage, lethal damage. I can't stand that system. It is so stupid. At least in that system, the idea of wounds means you've actually taken hits. You also don't roll, 6 hit, 7, 8 hit points every time you gain an advancement in power. You just have a wound track, and as your stamina goes up, you brush off more wounds, which makes sense, but the death spiral of that wound system is also really lame, and the way the bashing lethal kind of system falls off makes it so that, once again, throwing punches, it's just not as effective as using a knife. Once again, yes, realistic. Also, White Wolf, you play a fucking vampire, so, eat all of the dicks ever if you're trying to talk realism in this situation. Supers games actually tend to do it pretty okay. Mutants and Masterminds is great because you can just say your punch is a damage 15 attack, and it means the same thing as somebody who has a sword that's a damage 15 attack, or eye lasers that are a damage 15 attack. So it is absolutely possible to have Iron Fist and Cyclops using... It's actually impossible for someone like, I'm trying to think, Daredevil to throw hands well enough to actually matter in a world with people who can throw lightning bolt and, create flames, things like that. So once again, Supers role-playing games have it right. They're the ones who know what players want. They're the ones who are giving people what they want. With the exception of a small amount of annoying grognards who think that games should be realistic and I should have to pull out a protractor to calculate how much droppage my fucking cannon shell has when it fires. You guys are boring, and I don't want to say nobody likes you, but nobody actually likes you guys. You guys are really fucking annoying. You can look at a game like Exalted, which is about martial arts, really. It has a very kung fu, very wuxia vibe to it. And I'm not necessarily saying that your game should have these elements in it, but certainly there's things to consider. If your fighter is able to do things like shatter swords, Pathfinder, shatter swords and cut material component bags, which is the stupidest ruling that Paizo has ever put forward. And honestly, everyone at Paizo, even those of you who've been hired after Pathfinder 1st Edition, I hope you're embarrassed by that ruling. It is the stupidest ruling you've ever put forward, and I hate it, and I hate all of you for it. But if your fighters can do things like knock people prone, or even if your fighters can do things like have a sword that is on fire, your martial arts should be similarly cool. And Exalted, taking from Exalted is kind of an interesting way to do that, because, if you watch fantasy movies that have martial artists can often hit a dude hard, and yeah, a sword might be better, but martial artists can often do weird shit. And I'm not just talking about things like the breakfall that the, D&D monks have, because that's interesting, but the problem is not all classes are built with those kind of interesting but ultimately useless abilities. But like Exalted, like I said, the Sidriel are so fucking cool. They're mechanically a nightmare, but just because they're mechanically a nightmare in Exalted doesn't mean that there's nothing to be gained from their design. Because, like I said, the monks in Exalted, or the Sidriel in Exalted, can hit people and completely change their fate, their timeline. They can kick a dude in the face and all of a sudden he is, going to his wife leaves him because the Exalted that kicked him in the face changed his fate. They can punch a dude and completely remove him from last week. So there's an entire week missing just because the dude gave the guy a fucking stomach punch. And concepts like that are so fun and so cool and so fantasy martial arts that it is a blast. You can even look at some science fiction worlds. Like I said, there's ones that are more grounded in realism. MechWarrior is a great one. If you're brawling in MechWarrior, the reason you're brawling is because things have gone so far sideways for your character that this is desperate last-ditch effort. If your first course of action in MechWarrior is throwing hands, you honestly just don't fit in this very tactical, very grounded in realism universe. The mechs follow rule of cool, but one of the things about MechWarrior is the mechs in MechWarrior are not your standard anime mechs that fly around and like have laser swords. And I mean, they might now. MechWarrior's gotten kind of off the rails a little bit lately. Um, the idea of technologically, but anyway, but the game still tends to just be kind of grounded in reality. So like your mech's not doing like triple spin kicks. They're basically just tanks with legs. So like they're not, and yeah, you're just tanks with legs shooting lasers and missiles at each other. And likewise, if you're on foot, you're probably using a machine gun or a beam laser, or I think they have vibro swords, which is a little weird, but it is meant to be a little more tactical. And like I said, you know, you look at a game like Recon, which is meant to be a game set that takes place in the Vietnam conflict. Um, and it doesn't do a good job of it. There's some very, it was made in 1981, so there's some very uncomfortable elements in the game. But conceptually, it's meant to, you're a recon team. So if you're engaged with enemy combatants, you're probably not throwing hands. You're shooting them. And if shooting them is not an option due to closing the range or out of bullets, realistically, you're going to use a bayonet. You're going to use a combat knife because that's realistically what you would do in that situation. Throwing hands is not. Throwing hands is literally, help, I need to get out of here. So that's one of the things I said about, like I said, the original idea was to rank these. But punching a dude in MechWarrior and punching a dude in Dungeons and Dragons are not remotely comparable because they're not meant to be the same thing. Because one game is epic fantasy, one game is semi-gritty realism. And when I say gritty realism, I mean actual gritty realism and not the comically stupid Warhammer 40k gritty realism. And there's probably 40k fans here. And look, I'm sure your game is fun and all hail the God, Emperor, man, whatever. But I've always found your universe to be so fucking dumb, so much. Your universe is dumber than you want to admit it is. Like, I know a lot of people are like, oh, it's kind of dumb, but you take it a little more seriously than you probably should. And also, the company that owns it is absolute scum, so. But whatever, you know. Honest to God, there's worse things out there than 40k, even within the tabletop role-playing game space. So, you know, have fun with your little silly game. I don't really care. I'll dog on 40k because it's just kind of fun. But please note that when I dog on 40k, it is all in good fun. You guys are fine. Most of you guys are fine. Some of you guys are fine. And a couple of you guys are fine. But even in 40k, like, I guess there's like that weird like super boost shit. But MechWarrior and Shadowrun aren't in the same realm. I should be able to punch somebody better in Shadowrun than I do in MechWarrior. And the same goes for something like comparing Pendragon to Dungeons and Dragons. Pendragon's meant to mimic historical European colonialism. So throwing a punch, not exactly where you want to be in that world versus something like Dungeons and Dragons, where I should be allowed to play a dude who hits people with his flaming fists. But I just want to think a little bit more about when you're designing your game. if you are going for that epic fantasy or even the epic sci-fi, if you're going for an epic feel where characters are supposed to feel like these super cool badasses, um, let me play a punch. Let me play a punch wizard. Let me play a dude who can punch a dude into next week. Whether it means that my fists are as dangerous as a fighter's sword, or it means that I can use pressure points to do things that a fighter could never dream of. Anyway, yeah. So yeah, just punching a dude is so disappointing in games, and just ranking them is a exercise in futility. But if you want to see some cool ideas of martial arts, look into games themed around martial arts, like Feng Shui, like Weapon of the Gods, or like Exalted. And whether you like the game or not, they can give you some cool ideas of how different martial arts styles and themes can interact with your world. Because Dungeons and Dragons, really, as far as differing martial arts go, there's really only one, which is Way of the Open Hand. The other ones are trying real hard to mimic kind of wizardry stuff, which, sorry, give me 1 second. Hey, what are you doing? Get out of that. Get. Don't chew on wires, stupid. Sorry, my cat's trying to electrocute herself. Anyway, yeah, man, I lost my train of thought fashion. Oh, sorry. Hey, no. But anyway, yeah, so like looking at weird things that these games bring to the table, whether you like the game or not, they can bring some weird funness because when it comes to unarmed fighting, there's so many different ways of going about it. From fighting styles that emphasize control to fighting styles that emphasize, hard strikes to fighting styles that emphasize guard and counterattack to fighting styles that emphasize strange tactics to throw an opponent off guard. There's more to being a magic monk than throwing fireballs and acupuncture, and I wish fantasy games did more. Hell, the monk literally has an entire subclass based around not being a fucking monk. The Kensai, the weapon master. It's like, I want to play a monk, but I don't want to do what monks were kind of meant to do, which is kick a dude's head off. I want to be a monk, but I really want to be a fighter. And it's so disappointing. I'm not even saying that Kensei is necessarily bad. But what I'm saying is when there's so much limitation on unarmed fighting, giving the one class that's meant to be an unarmed fighter the option to not be an unarmed fighter, it's just disappointing. And that's really it. I'm not mad at unarmed fighting in tabletop role-playing games. I'm just disappointed. I'm just disappointed in you guys. You can do better. You're better than this. You guys just... You're not really putting forward the effort. It's just, you've let me down. As a parent, you've let me down. And just, I hope going forward, you guys can do better in the future. But that's it. I'll see you next week. Mwah!